Lisa, sorry, Lisa, Lisa, I'm struggling to shift the IEP a lot and figure out what actually needs to be in there. Yeah, so your IEP needs a makeover, huh? Well, I don't know if you have my book. We have to do the drawing before I leave too. So remind me, we'll do a drawing for my book, The Art of Advocacy. It's good to do a makeover. And Lisa, I don't know if you were on when I did talk about color coding IEPs. To me, that, because I'm real visual, that system helps me see at a glance. Like I highlight things in green that are the student's strengths. And if I don't see much green in that IEP, I know that's missing, right? And we need to be more specific about that. Or I highlight blue for parent input. And after I've reviewed the IEP, and if I don't see much blue, then that means I'm not seeing much parent input actually written into the IEP. You might have verbally said it at the meeting, but if it doesn't get in writing, then, right, it doesn't exist. So just simple color coding can help. I do like a pink highlighter for the child's needs. And then the other thing I look for is like, is there this common thread? Hopefully we're talking about inclusive education at the beginning, and that could be a strength for your child, how they learn when they are with their typical peers. And then when I look at IEP goals, I want to make sure that we have inclusion embedded in the IEP goals. And then, of course, as that thread continues and we look at, placement towards the end of the IEP, is it going to be an inclusive placement? And then for accommodations, sometimes I see it as this laundry list because I think it's easy with a lot of computer software programs. You can just have this pull down menu and just check all the ones that, you think apply. But I'm not sure that there's really a lot of thought of what kinds of accommodations are really specific for the student. So accommodations sometimes are a laundry list that gets copied and pasted into each, next IEP. And we don't even know if anybody is using those accommodations or if they're using something else that works. We want to get that in there. So yeah, doing a kind of a checkup, I guess, right? Not 100,000 miles, but maybe after a couple months of having an IEP in place to check and see, is this really happening? Do we see the consistency there too? But I want them to take out any reference to a specific or to a special ed program, because we are pushing toward more access points and scaffolding into the grade level curriculum. Yeah. Yeah, and that, I've done trainings on it before, but that is like so important to build inclusion into the IEP from the very beginning. I think a lot of parents think, oh, when we get to the end of the meeting, we're going to talk about how much time in general ed, that's when we'll talk about inclusion. And it's like, no, you have to make your case at the beginning of the meeting when you're talking about your child's strengths. For us, for Dylan, one of his strengths was that he really learned by watching others. I mean, he learned how to play Xbox games by watching his older brother play them, right? He learned to be a better reader by being in the, first, second grade class, when they were starting all these reading skills and having the expectations in general ed. So one of the strengths that we would always talk about is that he learns by watching his typical peers. And then when we went to needs, we said Dylan needs to be with typical peers in order to have, role models for communication skills. So in the strengths section, you can embed inclusion. In the needs section, you can embed inclusion. And your parent concern statements, for sure. The thing with parent concern statements is I would say that you want to, I would always suggest to email it ahead of time, whatever your statements are going to be, and ask that they be copied and pasted into the IEP. Otherwise, sometimes they're summarized and they don't often do a very good job summarizing the parents' concerns. So in the concern part, for sure, you can talk about inclusion. Some parents at the beginning of the meeting, before they even start going through the IEP form, will have everyone go around the room and talk about, 2 or 3 strengths that their child has. The parent gets to have a time where they say their strengths that they see for their child, but then the parent also has the floor to talk about the vision. And everybody keeping in mind that North Star of we want this child to have an inclusive life after high school. Therefore, every IEP counts as far as another step towards that North Star. And so you can embed inclusion that way at the beginning of the meeting. When you start writing your goals, you embed inclusion in there. So I say things like in the 2nd grade reading group, so-and-so will, listen to the small group, his peers in the small group reading. He will answer orally the questions, whatever. So each part really of the IEP, you want to embed inclusion. So she said it's part of the constraint system wrapped up with the assessment requirements. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, do we try to put all these Band-Aids on it and do we try to fix it? Or do we start anew, but then we have the constraint of we've got this federal law, and then do we go back to the law and say, okay, now what does it really require? And maybe we're doing some negative, harmful things in our process that the law doesn't even require. So yeah, I don't know. But I think on an individual level, you can make some significant changes at the IEP team meeting. And also, if you have other parents in your district, Lisa, do you have other parents that want to see change? Because that's like a whole another concept too, right? Of kind of having a movement within your district. So even if the State Department, has some kind of philosophy or whatever, at least for your child, his IEP, your school building, your district, you can make significant changes in there and how kids are looked at, right, by teachers. Love it. Lisa says, COVID is making all of it more difficult, and yes, also showing we can do things differently. And that's the thing. It's like, what can we take that we've learned from distance learning and then either try to replicate it or at least have that inform like future instructional strategies. And one of my hopes is that parents have learned so much more about their children as learners through, having to be at home and do more remote learning. And therefore, I think there will be richer discussions in IEP meetings because parents will feel, I think, more confident that they actually can tell now what helps their child learn better. Times of day, different things like that, manipulatives versus watching a computer program, and different things like that. So I think that's one of the silver linings of COVID, and hopefully some of these practices, like I said, will be embraced when we actually go back to the brick and mortar schools. And then who knows? I mean, it will be interesting. So many districts set up, digital, virtual, online schools, so they could still capture, parents and families that wanted their kids to stay within the district, but do something not inside the building. I wonder how many, parents are seeing that as like, this is so much better for my child. This fits how they learn. And how many students will still opt into more of an online education than an in-person, or will it be hybrid and they'll do some of both? I just think that there's a lot that we can do in our public schools to make more options available. And it's always bothered me when, school districts have like alternative high schools that kids can go to. I mean, it's great that there's another place that's a better match, but like, why can't our high schools now have that, also that sense of what we called alternative learning, which to me is like, I don't know, more hands-on, more choice, the student gets more voice. All of those aspects are what I would like to see in every high school, and not just for the kids that leave and go to the alternative high school. But tell me, okay, let me look here. It says, where can we find good information about collecting data on the academic goals and objectives? My son's school doesn't provide any data and doesn't use accommodations. So yeah, you need to look back in the IEP, Tamara, as far as what it says for progress monitoring. And some, depending on your IEP form, sometimes there are boxes that are checked. Sometimes it's typed in there like data collection. You might have observation, and being a former teacher, observation, I think, is valid, but we want to balance with that and more objective data. So sometimes it says work samples. So you need to look on the IEP for progress monitoring. Usually it's right under the IEP goal, how they're going to monitor, and also the frequency. So sometimes it's weekly, sometimes it's every other week, monthly. And what I also encourage parents to do is either amend the IEP, or at your next meeting is to zero in on that progress monitoring part in your IEP and get some kind of more specific language. And of course, you're going to get pushback because they would rather usually leave it more open. But, have things in there. So if they're collecting data every other week, or they're doing an observation every other week or whatever, then we can insert language in there that either raw data, the anecdotal notes, whatever it is, will be sent home to the parent every other week. And so it's not like you're asking them to do more than what's already written in the IEP. You're just wanting to be able to see that, so you have an idea of how your child's doing, what you can do at home to help, all of that. So go back in there. If they don't have data collection, Tamara, for any of the goals, that to me is like a huge red flag. But chances are, at least some of the goals hopefully will say data. And then you can make a written request, just send an email and say it would be really helpful for me to have these updates, and instead of waiting until the quarter is over, which is 9 weeks. But yeah, make that request. But chances are you're going to have to amend the IEP to get some more specific language in there. And Tamara, I don't know if you heard our discussion at the beginning about your question for accommodations, but what I had talked about was to look at the accommodations in the IEP for assessments, and then to look for the list of accommodations for more classroom activities, and see again how specific that language is. And I may sound like a broken record as far as being specific, but that's like the key to understanding. And when when parents hire me as an advocate, one of the first things I do is review the IEP, and not only color code it so I can see what's there easily and what's missing, but also to type questions in, because usually even the goals usually aren't very measurable, and the baseline doesn't go with the goal. And I mean, I rarely see a well-written IEP. And Dan says, so yes, statute from 1414. I think this is one of Pete Wright's favorite. The IEP must include a description of how the child's progress toward meeting the annual goals described in subclause 2 will be measured, and when periodic reports on progress the child is making toward meeting the annual goals, such as through the use of quarterly or other periodic reports concurrent with the issuance of report cards, will be provided. As far as, because pretty universal, people parents are only receiving progress reports on how their child did on IEP goals when report cards come out. So, if the 6th grade teacher, is sending out report cards, then the special ed teacher will send out a progress report. However, and if you look at the statute, and it's also again in the regulation, this is just an example, such as through the use of quarterly or other periodic reports. This is an example concurrent with the issuance of report cards. And people have kind of glopped onto that, like, oh, we only do progress reports when report cards go out. But progress reports can be individualized just like everything else in the IEP. Remember, we've got that little I there. And so for some IEP goals, you might want to get a monthly report. For other goals, you would say, okay, just let us know every 6 weeks. It depends. But so whatever you do for the IEP goals doesn't have to be that consistent with each goal. So you could have a more frequent progress report on social skills or behavior challenges and how the behavior plan is working. And in reading, you might say, well, every 6 weeks, we want to try a strategy for 6 weeks, and then we're going to check and see. And you can do this in a variety of ways. Some parents will have like a monthly meeting, and they'll, get a report orally. Some parents will say, send me your copy of your data that you collect every 2 weeks. Some parents will say, I'm good with every 9 weeks. Tell me how things are going. But it can be individualized. It doesn't have to be everybody gets this at report card time. And then you have districts, like there's this one district I've been working with, and so the parent had asked for more frequent reports, and the district is like, no, we don't have to do that. We're in compliance without having to do that. But then they were willing, like, to say that monthly, the special ed teacher would send copies of the data and the explanation of what the student had been working on to the parent. So that's pretty much like a progress report. But for the district, like, I don't know, to save face or something, it's like, no, we're only doing quarterly progress reports. That's what we have to do. Oh, by the way, and I mean, they wrote it in the IEP. We will provide monthly data reports and, explanation of what the student is working on and the progress. So it just depends. I mean, the goal is to find out more information, and you can find out information in a variety of ways. So what works good for you, what you can get agreement from the school is always helpful. So Tamara says, I love it, and the IEP kit as well. Yes, and I don't know and then the other thing is, I don't know if you guys have seen, like I wrote a distance learning advocacy toolkit. So if you want to get that, let me know in the comments.